On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. Within 6 weeks, the entire European continent was at war. Historians called it the July Crisis, a month when rational diplomats made increasingly irrational decisions until conflict became inevitable. But the assassination didn't cause World War I. It merely provided the spark for a powder keg that had been building for decades through economic competition, currency conflicts, and imperial rivalry. The real cause was financial desperation disguised as national pride. Today, 112 years later, the same pattern is unfolding with terrifying precision. The players have changed names, but the economic pressures, currency wars, and alliance tensions are identical to those that dragged civilization into its first global catastrophe. In 1914, the world's dominant empire faced challenges from rising powers backed by alternative monetary systems. Trade wars escalated into currency wars. Currency wars triggered financial crises. Financial crises demanded political solutions that required military enforcement. Sound familiar? Walk through the financial districts of any major city, and you'll feel the same electric tension that hummed through London, Berlin, and Vienna in the months before the Great War. Bankers speaking in urgent whispers, government officials holding emergency meetings, military advisors updating contingency plans. Everyone knows something is building, but nobody wants to acknowledge what it might become. The pattern that transformed a regional dispute into global devastation operates like clockwork across history. Economic systems under stress create political tensions. Political tensions demand military solutions. Military solutions trigger alliance obligations. Alliance obligations escalate local conflicts into worldwide catastrophes. We're not heading toward World War III because politicians want war. We're heading toward World War III because the economic mathematics demand it. The 1914 Economic Foundation. Understanding how financial crisis triggers global conflict requires examining the economic conditions that made war seem like the rational choice for European leaders in 1914. By 1910, Britain's economic dominance was cracking under pressure from German industrial efficiency and American financial power. The pound sterling faced its first serious challenges as the global reserve currency. British manufacturers couldn't compete with German innovation or American scale. British banks were losing market share to German financiers and American industrialists. Germany represented everything Britain feared: a rising power with superior technology, growing military strength, and economic dynamism that threatened established hierarchies. German steel production exceeded British output. German chemicals dominated world markets. German engineering revolutionized manufacturing processes. But Germany faced its own constraints. Despite industrial success, Germany remained dependent on British financial networks for international trade. German exports required London's banking system for settlement. German imports needed sterling for payment. Economic strength meant nothing without monetary independence. This created an impossible dynamic. Germany needed British cooperation to maintain economic growth, while German growth threatened British dominance. Britain needed German trade to maintain financial relevance, while German independence threatened British control. The tension escalated through economic warfare disguised as trade policy. Tariff battles, currency manipulation, resource competition, colonial disputes. Each side used economic weapons to weaken their rival while strengthening domestic constituencies that demanded increasingly aggressive responses. France complicated the equation by owing massive debts to both British and German banks, while maintaining military alliances that guaranteed conflict if tensions escalated. Russia owed even larger debts to French banks while facing internal revolution that demanded external military success to maintain legitimacy. The mathematics were brutal. Every major power owed money to rivals who simultaneously threatened their core interests. Economic cooperation required political submission. Economic independence demanded military preparation. When financial stress reached critical levels in 1913 and early 1914, political leaders faced impossible choices. Accept economic subordination to rivals, or risk everything on military solutions that might restore financial independence. They chose war because peace meant inevitable decline. The Cascade of 1914. How economics became war. The progression from financial tension to global conflict followed predictable stages that historians have mapped with devastating clarity. Stage 1. Trade wars, disguised as national security. Germany and Britain imposed tariffs on each other's goods while claiming protection of domestic industries. Both sides knew that successful trade wars require military backing for enforcement. Stage 2. Currency manipulation and gold hoarding. Countries began accumulating gold reserves while restricting rival access to monetary metals. Britain tightened gold lending. Germany increased silver purchases. France stockpiled both metals while Russia desperately sought Western loans to avoid bankruptcy. Stage 3. Alliance formation based on economic necessity. The Triple Alliance and Triple Entente weren't military partnerships. They were economic protection schemes designed to ensure resource access and debt payment during crisis periods. Stage 4. Military preparation justified by economic threats. Naval buildups, army expansion, industrial mobilization for war production. Each side claimed defensive preparations while building offensive capabilities that threatened rivals. Stage 5. Diplomatic crisis escalation. Every minor dispute became a test of alliance reliability. Every negotiation included implicit military threats. Every compromise appeared as weakness that invited further pressure. Stage 6. The trigger event that made war seem preferable to continued economic subordination. Franz Ferdinand's assassination provided the excuse, but any incident would have sufficed once the underlying pressures reached critical mass. The war began because continuing peace meant accepting economic arrangements that would have gradually bankrupted the losing parties. Military conflict offered the possibility of reshuffling global economic hierarchies through force, rather than accepting inevitable decline through market dynamics. The 2026 parallel. Same pattern, different players. Today's economic conditions mirror 1914 with frightening accuracy, but the scale is global rather than European, and the weapons are nuclear rather than conventional. The United States occupies Britain's 1914 position, the dominant empire facing challenges from rising powers backed by alternative monetary systems. American economic supremacy depends on dollar privilege that requires foreign cooperation, while American policies threaten foreign interests. China represents Germany's role. The rising industrial power with superior manufacturing efficiency and growing technological capabilities. Chinese production capacity exceeds American output in most categories. Chinese infrastructure spending dwarfs American investment. Chinese innovation threatens American technological dominance, but China faces constraints identical to Germany's 1914 situation. Despite industrial success, China remains partially dependent on dollar-based financial networks for international trade. Chinese exports still require some dollar settlement. Chinese imports need dollar reserves for payment. Economic strength means nothing without complete monetary independence. Russia plays a modified version of its 1914 role. The resource-rich power facing internal pressures that demand external military success to maintain legitimacy. Russian energy exports provide leverage, but Russian economy requires constant expansion to fund government operations and military modernization. The BRICS alliance replicates the economic protection schemes that preceded World War I. These aren't military partnerships, They're economic cooperation agreements designed to ensure resource access and payment settlement during crisis periods. Europe occupies France's 1914 position, heavily indebted to multiple sides while maintaining security arrangements that guarantee involvement in any major conflict. European debt to American investors exceeds $3 trillion. European energy dependence on Russian supplies creates additional vulnerability. European security dependence on American military forces ensures participation in American conflicts. The Middle East plays the Balkans' role, the unstable region where great power competition focuses because control determines resource flows and strategic positioning. Every local dispute becomes a proxy battle between larger powers seeking regional dominance. The financial pressure points. The economic stresses that are pushing 2026 toward conflict operate through the same mechanisms that triggered 1914, but with modern complexity and nuclear-age consequences. America's $36 trillion debt requires constant foreign borrowing to maintain government operations. When foreign central banks reduce treasury purchases, American financial stability depends increasingly on Federal Reserve money printing that weakens the dollar's international purchasing power. But dollar weakness threatens the reserve currency status that enables American deficit financing. If countries shift substantial trade settlement to alternative currencies, demand for dollars decreases, while supply increases through reverse capital flows. The mathematics are identical to Britain's 1914 sterling crisis, but the global impact would be exponentially larger. China faces the opposite problem. Massive trade surpluses generate dollar reserves that lose value through American monetary policy, while Chinese domestic growth requires infrastructure investment that dollar holdings cannot fund directly. China must either accept dollar depreciation or find alternative reserve assets and payment systems. The BRICS currency system represents China's attempt to escape this trap. But success requires reducing American economic leverage through methods that America interprets as hostile acts. Every step toward monetary independence appears as an attack on American interests, because American interests depend on foreign monetary dependence. Russia's energy exports provide temporary leverage, but long-term survival requires diversification that demands massive capital investment. Western sanctions limit access to development financing, while Eastern partnerships require technology transfers that reduce future competitive advantages. Europe's energy dependence on Russia and financial dependence on America create impossible dynamics during any US-Russia conflict. European survival requires Russian resources and American security, but American security requires opposing Russian expansion, while Russian expansion aims to secure European resources. These pressures create the same mathematical impossibilities that preceded 1914. Every major power needs cooperation from rivals who threaten their core interests. Economic cooperation requires accepting subordination to competitors. Economic independence demands policies that rivals interpret as aggressive threats. The alliance trap. Modern alliance systems replicate the mechanisms that transformed regional tensions into global warfare during July 1914, but with nuclear weapons that make miscalculation exponentially more dangerous. NATO's Article 5 guarantees American military response to attacks on any member nation. But NATO expansion has placed this guarantee on Russia's borders, creating tripwires that could trigger nuclear conflict over disputes that don't threaten American core interests. The BRICS partnership includes mutual economic support agreements that could escalate trade disputes into military confrontations. China's commitment to defend Pakistani economic interests could trigger conflict with India. Russian support for Iranian nuclear programs could prompt Israeli military action that demands Russian response. Bilateral defense agreements create additional escalation risks. American security guarantees to Taiwan require military response to Chinese unification attempts. Chinese commitments to North Korea demand support during any conflict with South Korea. Russian protection of Belarus ensures involvement in any Eastern European crisis. Each alliance seemed logical when negotiated separately, but combined, they create overlapping commitments that make local conflicts impossible to contain. Every regional dispute automatically involves major powers with nuclear weapons and global reach. The alliance trap operates through rational decisions by individual actors that produce collectively irrational outcomes. Each country signs agreements that seem to enhance security, but actually increase war risks by expanding the circumstances that require military response. The technological acceleration. The pattern that required months to develop in 1914 now unfolds in weeks or days due to technological acceleration of financial, political, and military decision-making processes. High-frequency trading algorithms can crash entire markets in minutes rather than months. Social media can mobilize political movements overnight rather than over seasons. Satellite surveillance can detect military preparations immediately rather than eventually. Cyber warfare can disable critical infrastructure instantly rather than gradually. This acceleration reduces the time available for diplomatic solutions, while increasing the pressure for rapid military responses. Leaders who might negotiate compromises over weeks or months must make immediate decisions based on incomplete information and domestic political pressures. Nuclear weapons compound the acceleration problem by requiring immediate retaliation decisions that cannot be reversed or reconsidered. The launch-on-warning protocols that prevent surprise attacks also eliminate the deliberation time that might prevent accidental wars triggered by technical failures or misinterpreted signals. Modern warfare capabilities enable conflicts to escalate from conventional to nuclear within hours rather than years. The graduated escalation that characterized previous world wars becomes impossible when individual weapons can destroy entire cities and targeting systems can reach any location globally. The economic mathematics of conflict, the brutal calculation that made war seem rational to 1914 leaders, applies with even greater force to 2026 decision-makers facing exponentially larger economic imbalances and shrinking diplomatic solutions. America cannot maintain global military commitments with an economy that produces $26 trillion while owing $36 trillion without foreign borrowing, that requires foreign cooperation that American policies increasingly discourage. The mathematics demand either dramatic military reduction or dramatic economic expansion through methods that threaten established relationships. China cannot continue economic growth with an aging population and declining birth rates without expanding resource access and market control through methods that neighboring countries interpret as territorial aggression, requiring American military response. Russia cannot fund government operations and military modernization with an economy dependent on commodity exports without expanding market share through methods that threaten American allies and require American opposition. Each major power faces economic pressures that demand policies incompatible with rivals' survival requirements. Compromise means accepting arrangements that gradually weaken core national interests until collapse becomes inevitable. Military conflict offers the possibility of resolving these contradictions through force rather than accepting inevitable decline through economic subordination to rivals. The point of no return. The progression toward conflict becomes irreversible when economic pressures exceed the capacity of diplomatic mechanisms to produce acceptable compromises for all major participants. This threshold was reached in early 1914, when Germany's economic growth required policies that Britain couldn't accept without sacrificing imperial dominance. Compromise meant German subordination or British decline, outcomes that neither side's domestic politics could sustain. The same threshold approaches in 2026, as American economic survival requires policies that China cannot accept without sacrificing economic independence, while Chinese survival requires policies that America cannot accept without sacrificing global dominance. The BRICS currency system represents the economic equivalent of Germany's 1914 naval expansion. A necessary defensive measure that the dominant power must interpret as an offensive threat requiring military response. Taiwan represents the political equivalent of Austria-Hungary's Balkan interests. A strategic position that both sides require for survival, but neither can share without accepting subordination to rivals. The South China Sea embodies the resource conflicts that made compromise impossible in 1914. Control determines economic flows that determine national survival for multiple nuclear-armed powers with incompatible requirements. The 2026 July crisis. The specific trigger for 2026's conflict remains unpredictable, but the economic pressures that will make military conflict seem rational are already building toward critical mass. American dollar dominance requires preventing BRICS currency adoption, but prevention requires economic warfare that BRICS members interpret as existential threats demanding military response preparation. Chinese economic survival requires expanding the BRICS system, but expansion requires policies that America interprets as attacks on fundamental American interests that demand military opposition. Russian energy leverage requires maintaining European dependence, but maintenance requires territorial control that European security requires American military forces to prevent. Each side pursues rational policies based on domestic economic requirements, but the policies combine to create international tensions that exceed diplomatic solutions and demand military enforcement. The trigger event, whether involving Taiwan, Ukraine, Iran, or any other flashpoint, will seem sudden and unexpected to populations who haven't followed the underlying economic pressures. But the conflict will be inevitable once those pressures reach critical mass, regardless of diplomatic efforts or political intentions. Just as Franz Ferdinand's assassination provided the excuse for a war that economic mathematics had already made inevitable, some future incident will provide the excuse for a conflict that 2026's economic contradictions are already making unavoidable. The pattern never changes. Only the names and locations shift, while the underlying dynamics remain constant across centuries. Understanding the pattern doesn't prevent the conflict. It only explains why prevention becomes impossible once the economic pressures exceed the capacity of existing systems to resolve them peacefully. The 1914 pattern is repeating. The economic mathematics demand it. The alliance structures enable it. The technological acceleration ensures it. The only question is timing. And the timing depends on when economic pressures exceed the breaking point of diplomatic solutions. Based on current trajectories, that moment arrives sometime in 2026.